Sarah Running Deer stood near the edge of the Red Canyon and watched the dust clouds fade into the distance. The cavalry soldiers were leaving after another tense meeting at the fort. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders even though the afternoon sun was warm. Something about watching those blue uniforms disappear always made her feel cold inside. She was 23 years old and had lived through more hardship than most people experienced in a lifetime. Her skin was the color of copper, like her grandmother had always said with pride. Her black hair hung in a thick braid down her back, but it was her eyes that people noticed most. They were dark and deep and seemed to hold ancient knowledge that made even the oldest soldiers uncomfortable when she looked at them directly. 3 years had passed since the government forced her people onto the reservation. Sarah remembered that day clearly. The long walk in the heat, the children crying, the elders trying to stay strong even though everyone could see their hearts breaking. They had lived free on this land for generations beyond counting. Now they lived in small spaces with government rations that were never enough and rules that made no sense. But Sarah had refused to let them break her spirit. While many of her people sank into sadness or anger, she found a different path. She learned English perfectly and became a translator at Fort Apache. The job gave her power in a strange way. She could hear what the soldiers said. She could read their papers. She could warn her people when trouble was coming. It was not freedom, but it was something. The white soldiers did not know what to make of her. She dressed in a mixture of Apache and white clothing depending on what the day required. She spoke their language better than some of them did. She walked into the fort with her head high and looked officers in the eye when she spoke. Some soldiers hated her for it. They called her names under their breath. They made crude jokes when they thought she could not hear. Others simply ignored her as if she were a piece of furniture. But then Captain James Mitchell arrived 6 months ago, and everything shifted in a way Sarah did not understand and did not want. He came from Massachusetts, which Sarah knew was far to the east where the trees grew thick and the winters were harsh. He was educated and proper in his manners. His hair was the color of sand and his eyes were gray like storm clouds. He was 30 years old and had fought in too many battles. Sarah could see it in the way he sometimes stared at nothing, with a look that suggested he was seeing ghosts. From the very first day James saw Sarah translating at the fort, something changed in his expression. Sarah noticed it immediately and it made her deeply uncomfortable. It was not the look that other soldiers gave Apache women. There was no disgust in his eyes. There was no crude hunger either. Instead, there was something else. Something that looked like recognition. Like he had been searching for something and suddenly found it. James treated Sarah differently than anyone else at the fort did. When she translated, he listened carefully to every word. When she gave her opinion on Apache customs, he actually wrote notes. When she entered a room, he stood up like she was a fine lady from his world. When their hands accidentally touched while passing papers, he pulled back quickly and apologized as if he had done something terribly wrong. The other soldiers noticed, of course. They started mocking James behind his back. They called him an Indian lover. They made jokes about him during card games. They wondered loudly if he had gone crazy from too much sun. Some of the crueler ones suggested worse things about what he really wanted from the Apache translator. James ignored all of it. His fellow officers were more direct. They pulled him aside and warned him that his career would be destroyed if he kept showing special attention to a native woman. They reminded him of the regulations. They told him about other officers who had been court-martialed for less. They said he was throwing away a promising future. But James could not seem to help himself. He found excuses to request Sarah for translation work. He asked her to help him understand documents that he clearly already understood. He requested her guidance on Apache customs that he had obviously already learned. Any reason to be in the same room with her. Any excuse to hear her voice. Sarah was not blind to what was happening. She noticed how his face softened when she walked into his office. She saw how his hands trembled slightly when he handed her papers. She heard the change in his voice when he spoke to her, compared to how he spoke to everyone else. She felt his eyes following her when she left a room. It made her angry at first. She did not need complications. She did not need a white soldier developing feelings that could only lead to disaster. She had seen what happened before. Sometimes soldiers took Apache women by force. Sometimes they made promises and then disappeared. Sometimes the women were cast out by their own people for getting too close to the enemy. Nothing good ever came from this kind of attention. Sarah tried to discourage him in small ways. She kept her answers brief and professional. She avoided looking at him directly. She made sure to never smile in his presence. She requested other translators whenever possible. But somehow James seemed to understand what she was doing, and it only made him more gentle and more persistent in the most respectful way possible. One afternoon, Sarah was walking back from the trading post when she heard angry voices. 3 soldiers had cornered a young Apache boy who had wandered too close to the fort. They were shoving him and laughing. The boy was maybe 12 years old and terrified. Sarah started walking faster, but before she could reach them, James appeared. His voice was cold as winter when he ordered the soldiers to step back. They argued that they were just having fun with the Indian kid. James repeated his order, and this time his hand rested on his sidearm. The soldiers backed away, muttering insults. James helped the boy up and spoke to him gently in broken Apache, asking if he was hurt. The boy shook his head and ran toward the reservation. Sarah had watched the whole thing from a distance. When James turned and saw her standing there, their eyes met for a long moment. She saw something in his face that shook her. It was not just attraction. It was not just kindness. It was something deeper. Something that looked like devotion. That night, Sarah lay awake in her small home on the reservation. Her grandmother slept nearby, breathing softly in the darkness. Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening. She thought about James standing up for that boy. She thought about how he never looked at her with ownership in his eyes. She thought about how he treated her like she mattered, like she was not just an Indian woman but a person worthy of respect. It terrified her because she realized something. She was starting to feel something back. Not love, not yet, but something. A curiosity, a softness, a wondering about what kind of man he really was beneath that blue uniform. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Sarah Running Deer had survived being forced from her homeland. She had survived watching her people broken and confined. She had survived by building walls around her heart and trusting no one from the white world. But now those walls had a crack in them, and the man responsible did not even know what he had done. He just kept showing up every day with gentle eyes and careful respect, and a patience that seemed endless. Sarah pulled her blanket tighter and whispered a prayer to her ancestors for guidance. She asked them what to do about the captain with the storm cloud eyes who looked at her like she was something precious. But the ancestors were silent, or perhaps they were simply letting her choose her own path. Either way, Sarah knew that something was beginning that she could not stop. Something that would change everything, and she did not know if she was strong enough to face what was coming. The canyon winds blew outside, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Somewhere a coyote called to the moon, and in the darkness Sarah Running Deer lay awake, knowing that her carefully built world was about to become much more complicated because of one white soldier who refused to look at her the way everyone else did. The morning sun had barely risen when Sarah heard the urgent knocking on her door. It was a young Apache runner bringing news that made her stomach turn. The government officials were coming to the fort today with a new proposal. They wanted to move the Apache people again, this time to Oklahoma territory where the land was even worse and farther from their ancestral home. Sarah dressed quickly and made her way to the fort. The meeting was scheduled for mid-morning, but she wanted to arrive early. She needed to prepare herself for what was coming. Her people had endured so much already. How much more could they be expected to bear before they broke completely? When she arrived at the fort, soldiers were already setting up the meeting room. Long tables had been arranged in a square. Chairs for the government officials and army officers on one side, chairs for the Apache elders on the other. Sarah would stand in the middle as translator. Always in the middle, never fully belonging to either side. The Apache elders arrived together, walking with dignity despite their anger. Sarah could see it in their faces. Her grandfather was among them. His name was Standing Bear, and he had been a great warrior before the reservation. Now he was old, but his spirit was still fierce. He caught Sarah's eye and gave her a small nod. She understood. Today would be difficult. The government officials arrived next. They wore fine suits and carried leather cases full of papers. Their faces showed no emotion. To them, this was just business. Just another negotiation with Indians who had no real power to refuse. Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she watched them take their seats. Captain James Mitchell entered the room last. He was not leading the meeting, but he had been ordered to attend. His eyes found Sarah immediately. She saw concern in his face. He had probably heard what this meeting was about. He took a seat near the back, away from the main table. The meeting began, and immediately Sarah knew there would be trouble. The official translator was a man named William Hobbs. He was lazy and careless. He spoke some Apache, but not well. He had been given this job because he was cheap and no one in the government cared if he was accurate. The government man started speaking. He used big words and complicated sentences. He talked about treaties and land allocations and federal policy. William Hobbs tried to translate, but Sarah could hear him getting it wrong. He was simplifying too much, missing important details, sometimes translating words that meant completely different things. The Apache elders looked confused. They asked questions, but William's translations of their questions were also wrong. The government officials thought the elders were being difficult. The elders thought the government was being dishonest. The gap between understanding grew wider with every exchange. Sarah stood against the wall watching this disaster unfold. She bit her tongue and tried to stay quiet. It was not her place to interrupt. She had not been asked to translate this meeting. But she could see where this was heading. Misunderstanding would lead to anger. Anger would lead to accusations. Accusations would lead to violence. The government man pulled out a map and spread it across the table. He pointed to Oklahoma Territory and started explaining why the Apache would be better off there. William translated something about new hunting grounds and better water. But that was not what the official had said at all. He had actually said the land was available because no one else wanted it. Standing Bear stood up suddenly. His hand moved to his side where he still carried a knife despite fort regulations. His voice was hard as stone when he spoke in Apache. He said the government was lying again. He said they were being treated like children, who could not understand simple words. He said his people would not be moved again like cattle. William Hobbs went pale. He translated only part of what Standing Bear said. He left out the part about lying. He made it sound like Standing Bear was just being stubborn. The government official frowned and made a note on his papers. He said something about the Apache being unreasonable as usual. Other soldiers in the room started shifting in their seats. Their hands moved toward their weapons. The Apache elders saw this and tensed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even though the sun was streaming through the windows. Sarah felt her heart pounding. She had seen this before. One wrong word, one wrong move, and people would die. Standing Bear's hand closed around his knife handle. A young soldier near the door drew his pistol halfway. The government official was still talking, completely unaware of how close they all were to bloodshed. William Hobbs was sweating and stammering, trying to translate but making everything worse. Sarah could not stay silent anymore. She stepped forward into the middle of the room. Her voice was clear and strong when she spoke in English. She said the translation was incorrect. She said there were serious misunderstandings happening. She said if they wanted peace, they needed accurate communication. The government official stopped talking and stared at her. His face turned red with anger. He demanded to know who she was and why she was interrupting. William Hobbs looked relieved and angry at the same time. The Apache elders watched Sarah with hope in their eyes. Before the official could order Sarah removed from the room, James Mitchell stood up. Every eye turned to him. His voice was calm but firm when he spoke. He said that Sarah Running Deer was the best translator at the fort. He said she spoke both languages fluently. He said if the government wanted this negotiation to succeed, they needed accurate translation. He said William Hobbs had been making errors that were creating unnecessary conflict. The government official sputtered with indignation. He said this was highly irregular. He said there were protocols. He said a female Indian translator was not appropriate for such important matters. His voice got louder with each objection. James did not back down. He said that accurate communication was more important than protocol. He said that if the official wanted to report him for insubordination, that was fine. He said he would put it in writing that the previous translations had been dangerously incorrect. He said the choice was simple: use Sarah and have a real conversation, or continue with William and risk violence. The room was completely silent. Sarah stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. James had just put his entire career at risk for her people, for truth. The other officers were staring at him like he had lost his mind. The soldiers looked confused. The Apache elders watched with careful attention. The government official finally nodded stiffly. He said fine. He said Sarah could translate. But he made it clear he would be filing a complaint about the irregularity. He told James this would be noted in his record. James simply nodded and sat back down. His eyes met Sarah's for just a moment. She saw no regret there, only quiet determination. Sarah took her place in the center of the room. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. She asked the government official to start again from the beginning. This time she would translate every word accurately, every nuance, every implication, the truth in both languages. The negotiation continued for hours. With accurate translation, the tone changed completely. The Apache elders could finally understand what was really being proposed. The government officials could finally hear what the Apache concerns actually were. There was still anger. There were still deep disagreements. But there was also real communication happening for the first time. Sarah translated everything faithfully. When the government man said something insulting, she translated it exactly. When Standing Bear spoke harsh truths, she did not soften them. She gave both sides the respect of honesty. It was exhausting. Every word mattered. Every phrase could tip the balance toward peace or violence. By late afternoon, they reached a compromise. It was not perfect. The Apache would still face restrictions and hardships. But they would not be forced to Oklahoma. Not yet, anyway. They would stay on their current reservation for at least another year. In that time, there would be more negotiations, more discussions. It was a small victory, but it was something. As the meeting ended and people filed out, Standing Bear approached Sarah. He spoke to her quietly in Apache. He said she had done well. He said she had honored their people by speaking truth. He said he was proud of her. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Sarah walked back to the reservation as the sun began to set. Her mind was spinning with everything that had happened. James had defended her in front of everyone. He had risked his position for her, and then he had admitted his feelings so plainly that she could not pretend she had misunderstood. The evening air was cool against her face, but she barely noticed. She kept replaying his words in her head, the way he had looked at her. The steadiness in his voice when he said he cared about her deeply and completely. No man had ever spoken to her that way, with such honesty, with such vulnerability. When Sarah reached her small home, her grandmother was sitting outside. The old woman was weaving a basket in the fading light. Her hands moved with practiced skill even though her eyes were clouded with age. She did not look up when Sarah approached, but she spoke quietly. She asked Sarah if the soldier with the kind eyes had finally spoken his heart. Sarah stopped walking and stared at her grandmother in shock. She asked how the old woman knew about James. Her grandmother laughed softly. She said that love was not something that could be hidden. She said she had seen the way the captain looked at Sarah. She had also seen the way Sarah tried not to look back at him. Sarah sat down beside her grandmother. She felt suddenly exhausted. She admitted that yes, James had spoken to her. She said she did not know what to do. She reminded her grandmother that he was a white soldier, an enemy, that her people would see this as betrayal, that his people would see it as disgrace, that there was no path forward that did not lead to pain. The old woman was quiet for a long time. Her hands kept moving, weaving strips of willow into patterns. Finally, she spoke. She told Sarah a story about her own youth, about a man from a different Apache band who had wanted to marry her. The families had been enemies for generations. Everyone said it was impossible, but her grandmother had chosen him anyway because his character was strong and his heart was true. She said that among their people in the old days, before the white man came with all his rules, strength and character mattered most. A man was judged by his actions, not by which band or tribe he came from. She asked Sarah what kind of man James had shown himself to be, not what color his skin was, not what uniform he wore, but who he was in his spirit. Sarah thought about this carefully. She thought about James standing up for the Apache boy who was being bullied. She thought about him defending her right to translate even when it could cost him everything. She thought about how he treated her with respect when others treated her like she was less than human. She thought about the pain in his eyes when he saw injustice and could not fix it. She admitted quietly that James seemed to be a good man. A rare man. Someone who tried to do right even when it was difficult. Her grandmother nodded. She said that perhaps Sarah should judge this captain by Apache values, rather than by the white man's rules about who could love whom. She said that the heart does not consult maps or respect boundaries drawn by frightened men, but Sarah was still afraid. She told her grandmother about all the things that could go wrong. The army would punish James, her people would reject her. They would have no place in either world. They would be alone against everyone. It seemed like too much to risk. Her grandmother stopped weaving and took Sarah's hands in her own. The old woman's grip was still strong despite her age. She said that yes, the path would be hard, but she asked Sarah a question. Would she rather live a safe life full of regret, or a difficult life full of truth? She said that Sarah had been brave in every other part of her life. Why should she become a coward when it came to her own heart? The words struck Sarah deeply. She had always prided herself on her courage, on not letting the white man break her spirit, on standing up for her people. But her grandmother was right. When it came to her own feelings, she was being afraid. She was letting other people's opinions control her choices. That night, Sarah could not sleep. She lay on her mat staring into darkness and thinking. She thought about James waiting for her answer. She thought about the look in his eyes when he had confessed his feelings. She thought about how careful he had been to say he would never pressure her, that the choice was completely hers. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She would test James, not cruelly but honestly. She needed to know if his feelings were real or just infatuation. She needed to know if he truly understood what he was asking for. She needed to know if he could handle the truth of who she was and what being with her would mean. Over the following weeks, Sarah began asking James difficult questions. She would find moments when they were alone at the fort and she would challenge him. She asked him what he really thought about the reservation system. She asked him if he believed Apache people were equal to white people, or if he secretly thought they were inferior. James never got angry at her questions. He answered each one thoughtfully and honestly. He admitted that the reservation system was a crime against humanity. He said the government was systematically destroying a culture and stealing land through broken treaties and lies. He said that anyone who spent real time with Apache people could see they were just as intelligent and capable as anyone else, often more so because they had survived things that would have broken softer people. Sarah asked him about his family back east. She asked what they would think if he married an Indian woman. James's face became sad when he answered. He said his family would likely disown him. His mother was very concerned with social standing. His father was a businessman who cared about reputation. A son who married an Apache woman would be seen as throwing away everything they had worked to build. She asked if that bothered him, if he would resent her for costing him his family. James looked directly into her eyes when he answered. He said that a family who would reject him for loving a good woman was not much of a family. He said he would miss them, but he would not trade Sarah for their approval. Not for anything. Sarah tested him in other ways too. She took him to the reservation and showed him how her people really lived, not the cleaned-up version that officers saw on inspection days. She showed him the rotten food in the government rations, the children with not enough to eat, the elders crowded into shelters that leaked when it rained, the sickness that spread because there was no clean water. She watched James's face as he saw all of this. She saw his jaw clench. She saw tears in his eyes that he tried to hide. She saw him getting angry not at her for showing him, but at the system that allowed this to happen. He asked what he could do to help. Not in a grand way, but in practical terms. What could one captain do to make things even slightly better? Sarah was surprised by his response. Most white people who saw the conditions on the reservation either blamed the Apache for being lazy, or they felt briefly sad, and then forgot about it. But James wanted to actually do something, so Sarah told him. She said they needed clean water. They needed real food, not spoiled rations. They needed medicine. James started using his own money to buy supplies, not in a showy way. He would quietly bring things to Sarah and ask her to distribute them. Clean blankets, dried meat, flour that was not full of weevils. He gave away so much that he barely had enough for himself. Sarah noticed he was getting thinner. When she asked him about it, he just shrugged and said he ate enough. One cold afternoon, Sarah found James chopping wood outside the fort. He was delivering it to families on the reservation who had no way to stay warm. His hands were covered in blisters and cuts. Sarah grabbed his hands and demanded to know why he was doing this, why he was hurting himself for people who were not his responsibility. James looked exhausted, but his eyes were clear. He said they were his responsibility. All people were his responsibility if he had the power to help them. He said Sarah had taught him what real honor looked like. Not following orders blindly, not protecting your own comfort. but standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. He said he was trying to be worthy of her, trying to prove that his words were not empty. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. She had been testing him to find his limits, to find the point beside her while the sun came up. Sarah was too tired to protest, too tired to maintain her walls. She leaned. James did not grab Sarah or kiss her the way she half expected. Instead, he took her hand gently and held it like it was something precious and fragile. His eyes were full of tears, but he was smiling. He told her that he would honor her choice every day, that he would learn her ways and respect her people, that he would never ask her to be anything except exactly who she was. Sarah felt her own tears falling now. She had built such high walls around her heart. She had promised herself she would never trust a white man, never let one of them close enough to hurt her. But James had climbed those walls so quietly and gently that she had not even noticed until he was already inside. They stood together in the early morning light, holding hands and making promises. James said they would face whatever came together. Sarah said she was still afraid, but that she was tired of being afraid. They both knew that the world would not accept what they were choosing. But in that moment, they did not care about the world. They only cared about each other. The next few days felt like living in a dream. James and Sarah were careful not to show their feelings in public. They knew they needed to be smart about this, but they found small moments to be together. A few minutes alone in the translation office. A walk near the canyon at sunset. Brief conversations that meant everything. James asked Sarah to marry him properly. He got down on one knee behind the fort where no one could see them. He had no ring to offer. No grand romantic gesture. Just his heart and his promise. Sarah said yes. She said it quickly before fear could change her mind. They would marry, but they knew it would not be simple. First, James needed to tell his commanding officers. He chose a morning when the fort was quiet. He went to the commander's office and requested a meeting. The commander was an older man named Colonel Harrison. He had been in the army for 30 years and had no patience for anything unusual. James stood at attention and spoke clearly. He said he intended to marry Sarah Running Deer. He wanted to do everything properly and officially. He was giving notice that he would be resigning his commission. He knew the army would not allow him to serve as an officer with an Apache wife, so he was choosing to leave with honor. Colonel Harrison stared at James like he had spoken in a foreign language. Then the colonel's face turned red with anger. He demanded to know if James had lost his mind. He said James was throwing away a promising career for an Indian woman. He used words about Sarah that made James's hands clench into fists, but James kept his voice calm. He said that Sarah Running Deer was going to be his wife, and he would thank the colonel to speak of her with respect. He said his decision was final. He would complete his current duties and then resign. Nothing the colonel said would change his mind. The colonel tried everything. He threatened James with a dishonorable discharge. He promised James would never find decent work. He said James's name would be ruined. He even suggested that James was not in his right mind and should be evaluated by the fort doctor. Nothing worked. James stood firm. Finally, Colonel Harrison dismissed James with disgust. He said James would regret this choice for the rest of his life. He said the army would accept his resignation, but James should not expect any favors or recommendations. James saluted and left the office. His hands were shaking, but his decision was made. Word spread through the fort within hours. Officers and soldiers all heard that Captain Mitchell was resigning to marry the Apache translator. The reactions were immediate and harsh. Some soldiers looked at James with disgust. Others laughed and made cruel jokes. A few officers who had been his friends stopped speaking to him entirely. The worst came during dinner in the officers' mess. James was eating alone when a lieutenant named Carson sat down across from him. Carson had always been jealous of James's success. Now he saw an opportunity to strike. He spoke loudly so everyone could hear. Carson said he always knew James was not fit to be an officer. He said only a man with no pride would marry a savage. He used words about Sarah that were so vile that James dropped his fork. The entire room went silent. Everyone watched to see what James would do. James stood up slowly. His face was calm, but his eyes were like ice. He asked Carson to repeat what he had said. Carson grinned and said it again using even worse words. James asked Carson to step outside. The lieutenant stood up eagerly, thinking James wanted to fight, but James did not hit him. Instead, he spoke in a voice that carried across the yard where other soldiers had gathered to watch. He said that any man who insulted Sarah running deer was insulting his future wife, and therefore insulting him. He said he would be happy to settle such insults in whatever way Carson preferred. He said this while looking Carson directly in the eye. Carson was bigger than James, but something in James's face made him hesitate. This was not a man playing games. This was a man willing to fight to the death if necessary. Carson backed down, muttering excuses. James told him that if he ever heard Carson speak Sarah's name again, there would be consequences. Then James walked away, leaving Carson humiliated in front of everyone. Meanwhile, on the reservation, Sarah was facing her own storm. Her uncle had heard about James's intention to marry her. He came to her home angry and hurt. He demanded to know if it was true. Was Sarah really going to marry a white soldier? Sarah faced her uncle with her head high. She said yes, it was true. She loved James and he loved her. They were going to build a life together. Her uncle exploded with rage. He said she was betraying her people. He said she was spitting on the graves of all the Apache who had died fighting the white man. He said she was choosing the enemy over her own blood. Sarah tried to explain. She told her uncle about James's character, about how he had stood up for their people, about how he gave his own food and money to help Apache families, about how he treated her with respect and honor. But her uncle would not listen. He said no white man could be trusted. He said James was using her. He said she would regret this choice. The argument grew heated. Other people on the reservation heard the shouting and came to see what was happening. Soon Sarah was surrounded by people yelling at her. Some defended her, saying she had the right to choose her own husband. Others agreed with her uncle, saying this was a betrayal. Families who had been friends for years started arguing with each other over Sarah's choice. Standing Bear, Sarah's grandfather, finally stepped forward. His voice was strong enough to silence everyone. He said that Sarah was a grown woman. She had proven her loyalty to her people many times. She had the right to choose her own path. He said that any man who was good enough for Sarah was welcome in their family regardless of what color his skin was. But then Standing Bear turned to Sarah. He asked her to be honest. Was she truly choosing James for love? Or was she choosing him because she thought it would make her life easier? Because marrying a white man would give her protection and privilege? Sarah felt anger flash through her at the question. But she understood why her grandfather had to ask. She answered loudly so everyone could hear. She said she was choosing the hardest path possible. Marrying James would cost her acceptance in both the white world and the Apache world. She would lose friends and family. She would face hatred from all sides. If she wanted an easy life, she would marry an Apache man or stay single. She was choosing James because she loved him despite knowing how hard it would be. Standing Bear studied his granddaughter's face for a long moment. Then he nodded. He said he believed her. He said he would stand with her even though others would not. But he warned her that the path ahead would test her in ways she could not imagine. He asked if she was truly ready for that. Sarah said she was as ready as she could be. That night, Sarah's grandmother held her while she cried. The old woman stroked Sarah's hair and said nothing. Sometimes there were no words that could make things better. Sometimes love required sacrifice and pain. The grandmother had known this when she married her own husband against her family's wishes. She knew what Sarah was facing. James and Sarah met secretly the next evening. They needed to make plans. James had enough money saved to buy a small piece of land outside the reservation, but not on Army property. It was not much, but it would be theirs. They could build a house there. Try to create a life between two worlds, but first they needed to actually get married. No church would marry them. No Apache ceremony would be allowed with a white man. They would have to find a justice of the peace willing to perform the ceremony. The journey to find the judge took 2 full days of hard riding. James and Sarah traveled through desert country, where the sun was merciless during the day and the cold bit deep at night. They spoke little during the ride. Both were lost in their own thoughts about what they were doing and what it would mean. On the first night, they made camp beside a small stream. James built a fire while Sarah prepared a simple meal from the supplies they had brought. They sat on opposite sides of the fire at first. The distance between them felt larger than just a few feet. It felt like the space between 2 different worlds trying to figure out how to meet. Sarah broke the silence first. She asked James if he had received any letters from his family. James shook his head. He said he did not expect to hear from them. His mother had very fixed ideas about proper behavior. Marrying an Apache woman was so far outside those ideas that she probably could not even comprehend it. His father would follow whatever his mother decided. Sarah felt guilt wash over her. She said she was sorry that James was losing his family because of her. James looked up quickly. His face was serious in the firelight. He said she should never apologize for that. He said he was not losing anything that mattered. He was gaining everything that did matter. He was gaining her. Then James asked Sarah about her own family. He knew her uncle had rejected her. He knew many people on the reservation had turned against her. He asked if she regretted her choice, if she wished she had chosen differently. Sarah thought carefully before answering. She said honestly that part of her did wish things were easier. She wished she could love James without it costing so much. But she did not regret choosing him. She said that for the first time in years she felt like she was making a choice for herself. Not for her people, not for survival, but for her own heart. That freedom was worth the price. James moved around the fire to sit beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence was warm and solid. He said they would build a new family together. Just the two of them at first. And maybe someday others would join them. People who understood that love was more important than the lines drawn on maps or the color of skin. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. She said she hoped he was right. She said she was afraid but also excited. She had never imagined a future like this before. A future where she chose her own path instead of having it chosen for her by circumstances in history. James put his arm around her and they sat together watching the fire until sleep claimed them. The next day they reached the town where the judge lived. It was a small dusty place with one main street and a few scattered buildings. People stared at them as they rode in. A white man and an Apache woman traveling together was unusual enough to draw attention. James kept his expression neutral, but Sarah could feel the hostility in some of the stares. They found the judge's office in a building that also served as the general store. The judge was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes. His name was Judge William Carson. He looked up from his desk when they entered and studied them both carefully. He asked what they needed. James spoke clearly. He said they wanted to get married. He explained that he was a former Army captain and Sarah was Apache. He said they knew it was unusual, but they loved each other and wanted to do this properly and legally. The judge listened without interrupting. His face showed no judgment, only careful consideration. When James finished speaking, Judge Carson turned to Sarah. He asked her directly if this was what she wanted. He asked if anyone was forcing her or pressuring her. He wanted to hear from her own mouth that this was her choice. Sarah appreciated that he asked. It showed respect, she answered firmly. She said yes, this was absolutely her choice. She said she loved James and wanted to be his wife. She understood the difficulties they would face, but she was choosing this freely. The judge nodded slowly. He said he would perform the ceremony, but he wanted to speak with them first. He wanted them to understand what they were getting into. Judge Carson spoke plainly. He said that marriage between a white man and an Apache woman was legal, but that did not mean society would accept it. He said they would face hatred from both communities. They would struggle to find work and housing. Their children, if they had any, would belong to neither world fully. People would spit at them in the street. Some might even try to hurt them. He said he had seen other mixed couples over the years. Some had survived and built good lives. Others had been destroyed by the constant pressure and hatred. He wanted James and Sarah to enter this marriage with their eyes open. He would not perform the ceremony unless he was convinced they truly understood what they were choosing. James and Sarah looked at each other. Then James spoke. He said they had already faced rejection from their families and communities. They already knew the world did not want them together, but they also knew that giving up on each other would be worse than any hardship they might face. Sarah added that they were both strong people. They had survived many difficult things. They would survive this too. Judge Carson studied them for a long moment. Then he smiled slightly. He said he believed them. He said he would be honored to perform their marriage ceremony. He asked if they wanted to wait or do it immediately. James and Sarah both said immediately. They had waited long enough. The ceremony was simple and quick. The judge asked if they had rings. They did not. He said the rings were not important. What mattered were the promises. He asked James if he took Sarah as his wife to love and honor for the rest of his life. James said yes with absolute certainty in his voice. Then the judge asked Sarah if she took James as her husband to love and honor for the rest of her life. Sarah felt her heart pounding. This was the moment. Once she said yes, there was no going back. She thought about her grandmother's words about judging by character instead of skin color. She thought about James giving away his food to hungry children. She thought about him standing up for her people when no one else would. She said yes. Judge Carson pronounced them married. He said that by the power vested in him by the territory, they were now husband and wife. James turned to Sarah and very gently cupped her face in his hands. He kissed her softly. It was their first kiss. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. They were married. Against all odds and all expectations, they were married. The judge prepared the marriage certificate and had them both sign it. He signed as witness. He gave them the document and told them to keep it safe. He said there might come a time when they would need proof that their marriage was legal. He wished them luck and told them his door was always open if they needed help. James and Sarah left the judge's office as husband and wife. They stood in the dusty street holding hands. Other people walked past giving them strange looks, but they did not care. They had done it. They had made their choice official and legal. Now they had to figure out how to live with that choice. They decided to stay in the town for one night before heading back. James paid for a room at the small hotel. The owner looked unhappy about renting to them, but he took their money. James carried their few bags upstairs while Sarah followed. When the door closed behind them, they were alone together for the first time as a married couple. The room was simple with just a bed and a small table. Sarah suddenly felt nervous. She had been so focused on getting married that she had not thought much about what came after. James seemed to sense her nervousness. He told her gently that they did not have to do anything she was not ready for. They had the rest of their lives. There was no rush. Sarah felt grateful for his patience. She said she just needed time to adjust to everything that had changed. James agreed. He suggested they just talk for a while, get comfortable being married before anything else. So they sat together on the bed and talked about their plans. James explained that could tell from the way they rode that these were not friendly travelers. James moved his horse closer. When James and Sarah arrived at the land James had purchased, they stood together looking at what would become their home. It was empty land with nothing but desert brush and a small creek running through it. There were no buildings, no fences, nothing but possibility and hard work ahead of them. Sarah dismounted and walked across the property. The land was between the reservation and the nearest town. It belonged to no one's territory completely. That was good. It meant they could exist here without fully belonging to either world. She could see the distant mountains that marked Apache land. She could also see the road that led to white settlements. They would live in the middle, always in the middle. James came up beside her. He asked what she thought. Sarah turned to him and smiled. She said it was perfect. It was theirs. That was all that mattered. They could build something here that belonged to both of them equally, a place where they made the rules, where their love was not questioned or judged. James pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. He promised her he would build her a good home. They spent the first week living in a tent while James began constructing a small house. Sarah helped as much as she could. She gathered stones for the foundation. She hauled water from the creek. She prepared their meals over an open fire. The work was exhausting, but there was something satisfying about it. Every nail James hammered was building their future. Some Apache people from the reservation came to see what was happening. A few brought gifts. Sarah's grandmother arrived with blankets and dried meat. She blessed their home in the traditional way. She told Sarah she was proud of her for following her heart, but others came just to stare or to express disapproval. Sarah's uncle rode by but did not stop or speak. The rejection still hurt. White settlers also noticed the construction. A few rode past and saw James working alongside his Apache wife. Word spread quickly. Some people were simply curious. Others were openly hostile. One afternoon, a group of men stopped and told James he was bringing down property values by living with an Indian. James told them politely to leave his land. They left, but their hatred lingered in the air. Despite the opposition from both sides, James and Sarah continued building. Within a month, they had a small but solid house. It had 2 rooms, one for living and eating, one for sleeping. It was not fancy, but it was sturdy and it was theirs. The day they moved in, Sarah cried. These were good tears. Tears of accomplishment and hope. James found work as a guide for travelers who needed to cross Apache territory safely. His knowledge of the land and his relationship with Sarah's people made him valuable. It was not steady work, but it brought in money. Sarah continued her translation work at the fort. Colonel Harrison was no longer there. The new commander cared more about getting accurate translations than about Sarah's marriage. She was grateful for that small mercy. Life settled into a routine. James would leave for days at a time on guiding jobs. Sarah would work at the fort or help families on the reservation. When James returned, they would spend evenings together planning for the future. They talked about expanding their house, about getting chickens and maybe a cow, about the life they were slowly building together. But the hatred from the outside world never fully disappeared. One night, James came home with a black eye and bruised ribs. Sarah gasped when she saw him. She demanded to know what happened. James tried to brush it off, but Sarah insisted. Finally, he admitted that some men had jumped him in town. They beat him while calling him a traitor and worse names about Sarah. Sarah felt rage burn through her. She wanted to find those men and make them pay, but James held her hands and told her that violence would only make things worse. He said they had to be smarter than their enemies. They had to survive by being careful and staying together. Sarah hated that he was right. She cleaned his wounds and held him that night, wishing she could protect him the way he tried to protect her. A few weeks later, it was Sarah's turn to face violence. She was walking back from the fort when 3 white women blocked her path. They were wives of soldiers. They started saying terrible things about her, about how she had seduced a good white man, about how she was corrupting him, about how mixed marriages were against God and nature. Sarah tried to walk past them, but one woman shoved her. Sarah stumbled but caught herself. She looked at the women with calm dignity. She said she had done nothing wrong. She and James loved each other and were legally married. She suggested they examine their own hearts to see why that bothered them so much. Then she walked past them, leaving the women sputtering with anger. When Sarah told James what happened, he was furious. He wanted to report the women to their husbands or to the fort commander. But Sarah stopped him. She said making official complaints would only bring more attention to them. More hatred. More problems. She said they needed to pick their battles carefully. James hated it, but he agreed. Despite these incidents, James and Sarah also found unexpected allies. A white rancher named Tom Morrison started hiring James for work. Tom had traveled extensively and had an open mind. He said he judged men by their character, not by who they married. He paid James fair wages and treated him with respect. Sarah found an ally in a missionary woman named Margaret Collins. Margaret worked on the reservation trying to help Apache families. She was one of the few white people who treated Apache with genuine compassion. When she learned about Sarah's marriage, she came to visit. She told Sarah that she admired her courage. She said real love was rare and precious and should be celebrated, not condemned. Margaret and Sarah became friends. Margaret would visit their home and share meals with them. She brought news from the reservation and from town. She became a bridge between Sarah and some parts of the white community. Through Margaret, a few other families began to accept James and Sarah. It was a small group, but it meant they were not completely alone. Winter came and brought new challenges. The house was warm enough, but supplies were harder to get. Some shopkeepers in town refused to sell to James. He had to ride further to find merchants who would take his money. Sarah faced similar problems. Some Apache families still refused to speak to her. She was caught between worlds with full acceptance from neither. One particularly cold night, Sarah and James sat by their fire. Sarah was quiet and James could tell something was bothering her. He asked what was wrong. Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then she told him she was pregnant. She was going to have a baby. James stared at her in shock. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. He said this was the best news he had ever received. They were going to be parents. They were going to create a new life together. Sarah felt relief wash over her. She had been afraid of how he would react, but his joy was genuine and complete. But Sarah's joy was mixed with fear. She asked James what kind of world they were bringing a child into. Their child would be half white and half Apache. The child would face hatred from both sides, would never fully belong anywhere, would grow up knowing that many people thought the child should not even exist. Was it fair to bring a baby into that reality? James grew serious. He took Sarah's hands and looked into her eyes. He said their child would grow up knowing love, real unconditional love from both parents. Their child would learn both Apache and white ways, would be fluent in both languages, would understand both cultures. Their child would be a bridge between worlds. Yes, it would be hard. Yes, their child would face challenges, but their child would also be strong and unique and loved. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. She said she was scared. James said he was scared too, but they would face this together like they faced everything else. They would protect their child as much as possible. They would teach their child to be proud of both heritages. They would create a home where their child knew safety and love even if the outside world was cruel. Over the next months, Sarah's belly grew. James became even more protective. He took fewer guiding jobs so he could stay close to home. He expanded the house, adding another small room for the baby. He built a cradle from wood he cut himself. Every night he would talk to Sarah's belly, telling their unborn child stories and making promises about the future. Sarah's grandmother came to visit when she heard about the pregnancy. The old woman examined Sarah to help Al. Years passed and the small house on the edge of two worlds became a real home. Thomas grew from a baby into a curious and energetic child. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's smile. He spoke both English and Apache, fluently switching between them without thinking. He learned Apache songs from his great-grandmother and English stories from his father. He belonged to both worlds completely. 2 more children followed Thomas. A daughter they named Maria, who had James's gray eyes and Sarah's strong spirit. Then another son called David, who was quiet and thoughtful like his grandfather Standing Bear. The house that James had built with his own hands expanded to hold their growing family. Each addition was built with love and hope. The children grew up knowing they were different. They understood that some people did not approve of their family, but inside their home they knew only love and acceptance. James taught them to read and write in English. Sarah taught them Apache customs and the stories of their ancestors. The children learned to be proud of both parts of themselves. Life was not always easy. Money was often tight. James worked hard as a guide and sometimes as a ranch hand. Sarah continued translating and also started teaching English to Apache children on the reservation. Together they earned enough to feed their family and keep the house in good repair. They were not wealthy, but they had what mattered. The hatred from the outside world continued, but it changed over time. Some people who had been hostile at first began to soften. They saw that James and Sarah were good parents, that their children were well-behaved and bright, that their love was real and lasting. A few neighbors started treating them with cautious respect. Tom Morrison, the rancher, became a true friend to the family. He hired James regularly and paid him fair wages. When his own children were old enough, he let them play with Thomas and Maria. He told anyone who would listen that James Mitchell was one of the finest men he knew. His support meant more than he probably realized. Margaret, the missionary woman, became like an aunt to the children. She visited often, bringing books and treats. She helped Sarah when the children were sick. She stood up for the family when other white people spoke badly about them. Her friendship was a constant reminder that not everyone judged them for their choices. On the reservation, attitudes also shifted slowly. Sarah's grandmother remained a fierce defender of the family, until she passed away peacefully in her sleep when Thomas was 7. Her death hurt Sarah deeply, but the old woman had lived long enough to see that her granddaughter's choice had led to a good life. Standing Bear also changed his view over time. He watched James work hard to provide for his family. He saw how James treated Sarah with respect and partnership. He noticed that James was teaching the children Apache ways with genuine reverence, not mockery. One day, Standing Bear came to their home and spoke to James directly. He said that he had been wrong to doubt James's character. He said James had proven himself to be a man of honor. He formally welcomed James into the family and gave him an Apache name. He called him Stands with Courage because James had stood firm in his love for Sarah despite all opposition. James was deeply moved. The acceptance of Sarah's grandfather meant everything. More Apache families began accepting James and the children. They saw that the children were being raised to honor their Apache heritage. Thomas could track animals and start fires in the traditional way. Maria could weave baskets as beautifully as any Apache girl. David learned the old stories and could recite them perfectly. The children were not abandoning their Apache blood. They were honoring it while also honoring their white heritage. The family became known throughout the territory. Other mixed couples started seeking out James and Sarah for advice and support. People who faced the same hatred and rejection found hope in seeing that James and Sarah had survived and built a good life. James and Sarah welcomed these couples into their home. They shared their experiences and offered encouragement. Sarah started organizing gatherings for mixed families. Once a month, they would meet at James and Sarah's home. They would share food and stories. The children would play together. The adults would discuss their challenges and support each other. It became a community of people who did not fit neatly into either the white world or the Apache world, but who created their own space. These gatherings caught the attention of a newspaper reporter from back east. He came to interview James and Sarah. He wanted to write about their unusual family and the community they were building. Sarah was hesitant at first. She did not want more attention, but James convinced her that maybe their story could help others. The article was published in several newspapers. It told the story of a white army captain who gave up everything for love, of an Apache woman who chose her own path, of the family they built together against all odds. The article was surprisingly fair and positive. It presented James and Sarah as pioneers of a new kind of family, as proof that love could bridge even the widest divides. Letters started arriving from all over the country. Some were from people who supported them and found their story inspiring. Others were hateful messages from people who thought mixed marriage was wrong. James and Sarah read them all. They answered the kind letters and threw away the cruel ones. They refused to let hatred take up space in their home. One letter came from James's sister in Massachusetts. It was the first communication from his family in over 10 years. She wrote that she had read the newspaper article. She said she was sorry for how the family had treated James. She said she wanted to know her nieces and nephew. She asked if James would consider letting her visit. James showed the letter to Sarah. He said the choice was hers. If she did not want his family in their lives, he would understand. Sarah thought about it carefully. She remembered the pain James had felt when his family rejected him. She knew how much he missed them, even though he never complained. She told James to invite his sister. Family was important. If his sister was willing to accept them, then she should be welcomed. James's sister Elizabeth came to visit the following spring. She was nervous when she arrived. She did not know what to expect. But when she saw the warm home James and Sarah had created, when she met her nieces and nephew who were polite and intelligent and happy, when she saw how deeply James and Sarah loved each other, she cried. She apologized for all the years they had lost. She said she had been wrong to judge them. Elizabeth stayed for 2 weeks. She got to know Sarah and found her to be one of the strongest women she had ever met. She played with the children and told them stories about their father when he was young. She helped Sarah with cooking and cleaning. She learned a few words of Apache. When she left, she promised to write regularly and to visit again. She also said she would work on their parents. Maybe in time they too could accept what James had chosen. True to her word, Elizabeth wrote often. She sent packages with books and clothes for the children. She kept James informed about family news. And slowly through her efforts, their parents began to soften. They never fully accepted the marriage, but they acknowledged that James had built a respectable life. They sent small gifts for the grandchildren they had never met. It was not perfect, but it was progress. As the children grew older, they started to understand more about what their parents had sacrificed for each other. Thomas asked his father one evening why he had given up being an army officer. James explained that being Sarah's husband was more important than any career. He said some choices in life are easy and some are hard, but the hard ones that you make for love are the ones you never regret. Maria asked her mother if she was sad that some Apache people still would not speak to her. Sarah told her daughter honestly that yes, it made her sad sometimes, but she said that she had gained more than she had lost. She had gained a partner who respected her, children who made her proud, a life she had chosen for herself. That was worth more than the approval of people who could not understand love. The children learned from their parents that courage meant standing up for what you believed in even